The member that his time has expired. The question, members, is the amendment moved by the Honourable Trevor Mallard that the amendment be agreed to. I now call the Honourable Jerry Brownlee.
Mr Speaker, we most certainly will not be agreeing to the amendment. We will be supporting the motion moved by the Honourable Kate Wilkinson. Mr Speaker, with regard to the last speaker, let me say the only foreigners who came to this country and shook us down were the Australian Unionists who came in here and destroyed exactly the sort of industrial relations, settled arrangements that Trevor Mallard spoke of. That is absolute fact. This film was going to be made in New Zealand 8 weeks ago, and then Mr Simon Whipp, the Australian Unionist, got the International Federation of Actors to put a black ban on the film, telling all actors not to sign on unless it was with a contract negotiated by the Australian Union. And every member on that side of the House knows that. They've seen that resolution. And I'd ask them, what on earth has the CTU abandoned workers in this country for? Why have they not been the union that stepped up and worked for actors and others in this country? They didn't do it. They simply abandoned them to the Australian Union. Make no mistake, Mr Mallard, the only foreigners who've come into this country to shake us down have been the Australian unions led by Mr Simon Whipp. Mr Speaker, Mr Mallard's speech was a very sad rewrite or attempt at rewriting history. There is no way in which the relationship between the New Zealand government and Warner Brothers is any worse today than it was, it is any worse as a result of this. Far from it. Fortunately, Mr Speaker, we've been able to pull out of the fire a dreadful situation and turn it into something that will be particularly good for the New Zealand film industry in the long run. Mr Mallard asks who wins, who gains, who loses. Well, Mr Speaker, I can tell you that it is workers in that industry who have won out of this. Workers in this industry who won out of this. Mr Speaker, I'm wearing my red tie today, something I never do in this House, because I do so in solidarity with the workers who marched on Labour Day in support of the government's actions in this case. Mr Speaker, we have a dynamic film industry in this country. A dynamic film industry in this country built up by very creative people, built up by the expertise of the crews, the technical crews that work behind those films. And Mr Speaker, that is what has been put at risk in the last 7 or 8 weeks by the Australian Union. So let's get clear about how this worked. First, we had a film made here earlier this year by Warner Brothers called Yogi Bear. That film had no problem whatsoever. Not a squeak, not a skerrick of murmur from the union. They let that one slide through. But as soon as the big numbers come on the table, as soon as the big opportunities for New Zealanders come on the table, without any reference to Warner Brothers, without any discussion with Peter Jackson, we had the Australian Union setting out to put a black band on that picture. That is absolute fact. And then, Mr Speaker, we had the sorry spectacle of the CTU being put in a position of having to support that position. I feel sorry for Helen Kelly. I think she's done the union movement in this country irreparable damage, at least for a long number of years, because they've been put on the back foot and having to defend the indefendable position taken by that Australian Union. Mr Speaker, I've seen some of the actors who want to work on this production in the streets protesting against the union's activity. And anyone on that side of the House who wants to say that people somehow are misled or otherwise assumes that they aren't intelligent enough to work out that without these films being here, this industry will not grow. Mr Speaker, the government has moved to try and get things back on the right track. And I want to make it very clear, Warner Brothers did not tell us what to do. They laid out in front of us their deep concerns about the security they would have in making a film in New Zealand, in this case 2 films in New Zealand, where at any time a union in Australia could call for industrial action that would slow them up. And I want an explanation out of the great party of the workers, the Labor Party. Why do they support Australian unionist activities in New Zealand? It's a pretty simple question. Are you New Zealand leaders in that movement not capable of representing those issues? Further, Mr Speaker, it's well known that most people engaged for their skills, for their trade, for their creativity in the film industry do so on the basis of being a contractor to that event-based employment opportunity. Now, Mr Speaker, they get a number of opportunities that arise from that around taxation, etc., and the freedom to be able to run their own lives. I'd ask this question, Mr Speaker, what is so wrong with that? What is so wrong with that? This is an industry that pays at the higher levels. Mr Mallard made that clear in his speech. So why is there so much animosity towards this union, towards this industry? What I can say, Mr Speaker, is that a collective contract like for something like this simply won't work. I don't believe for 1 minute that Sir Ian McCallum or any of the other international stars who might end up in this production were running around saying, I can't wait for Mr Whip and his Australian Union to sort out a collective contract for me to sign up to. What I would say is that if every worker on that, or every person who's engaged in producing that film was paid the same as Sir Ian, then the rest of them might well want to have a collective contract. So there's a whole lot of mismatches in here that are problematic. Further, Mr Speaker, a wee time ago there was a case called the Bryson case. And what came out of that is that if you apply the IRD tests, in Bryson's case it was deemed that he may not have been a contractor and that the relationship was more in the nature of employer-employee. Now that proved to be very, very expensive for the production company. Mr Speaker, this bill sets out to make it abundantly clear that if someone is employed, or should I say contracted, for services on these films and others, they will be treated as contractors with no right to go and have that status questioned. And people will say, well, that's a removal of rights. But, Mr Speaker, if someone says, I sign up, I want to be a contractor, where is the right for the person who's on the other side of that, the contractee, to expect that that's what they are? I think, Mr Speaker, having a provision that says at any time a person may run off to the employment court and say, I'm going to now change my status, will you help me, is utterly ridiculous. And Steve Chadwick over there shakes her head and says, that's ridiculous. She's right. It's utterly ridiculous. But that's what happened in the Bryson case. And I finished my speech, Mr Speaker, by saying that if Simon Whip, the Australian unionist, had not put the black band on this film, we would not be in this situation. We would not have had to go through the exercise we have over the last couple of days. And I want to make it abundantly clear again, there has been no request or you would say pressure from Warner Brothers to change our law. There has been agreement between the two that this is an issue, this needs to be sorted out, and that's what this bill sets out to do. So finally, Mr Speaker, a simple question for speakers to come. Why do New Zealand workers need an Australian union representing them in this industry, and what has that Australian union achieved for them? Nothing but grief.
Members, before I call the next